Welcome back to the Adrenal Fatigue Podcast. It's Angela and Danielle here, and we're thrilled to have Brie Wieselman in the house today, a gut and hormone specialist. More on that in a moment. Brie and her team of practitioners are part of our in-house functional medicine team here inside the collective and the Fatigue to Fabulous program. Brie also happens to be one who diagnosed me with stage 3 adrenal fatigue almost a decade ago and was responsible for really changing my whole life. After years of struggling with unexplained symptoms, no answers, exhaustion, fertility issues, all the things, and struggling to become a mom for over a year, within 3 months of her guidance and protocols and taking a holistic approach to healing, I was almost back to myself. And within 6 months, I was pregnant and I was experiencing the most wonderful pregnancy. And honestly, I've never gone back. Brie is so incredibly knowledgeable. And that's why we asked her to come on today to talk about this really important topic on hormone replacement therapy. Hormone replacement therapy is a popular treatment for those suffering from hormone-related issues, particularly with menopause. It's popular in mainstream medicine, but doesn't come without its hosts of issues that we feel should be discussed. It's important for people to know that this isn't the only choice out there that they have, which is how it often can feel in mainstream medicine. The good thing is we know that there are other options, and we here at the Collective have the pleasure of sharing these alternatives with the world, educating people, and facilitating the recovery journey on many pre and post menopausal journeys for women who want another way. So we believe this will be a very informative and helpful conversation for many of you out there.
So we're so thrilled to have Brie Wieselman here today. Brie is a licensed acupuncturist and a master of traditional Chinese medicine, and is a licensed primary care provider and medical director of Brie Wieselman Integrative Health. For the past 14 years, Brie has paved the way for quality functional care, working with thousands of clients across the globe. Besides being an expert in hormone balance and fertility optimization, she specializes in helping people heal digestive problems such as candida overgrowth and SIBO to rebuild a bulletproof microbiome. Prior to founding the clinic, Brie spent several years specializing in integrative treatment of infertility and subfertility at several IVF centers and fertility practices in the San Francisco Bay Area, and also in a local clinic specializing in the integrative treatment of hepatitis C. Brie, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back.
So to start things off, can you just tell us what hormone replacement therapy is in a nutshell for people who maybe haven't heard of it?
So, at the most basic level, hormone replacement therapy is just using exogenous forms of hormones. And that word simply means that they're created outside of your body and taking them into your body. And those come in different forms and delivery mechanisms. Typically, in the realm of the medicine that I'm working with, we're talking strictly about body bioidentical hormone replacement, which means that the hormones are an exact molecular match for the hormones your body creates. And so your body cannot tell the difference when using those hormones as compared to the hormones you make internally.
So clear. I love that. Thank you for breaking that down for us. So yeah, I'm curious as to the main factors or issues that lead someone to inquire about hormone replacement therapy or go down that road. What are the most common symptoms you see?
Absolutely. So I use hormones in my practice in a couple specific different ways and with different patient populations. So one of them is definitely going to be the first place we think about the words hormone replacement therapy is in women who are undergoing a perimenopausal or menopausal change in their life, which we have to remember is a healthy and natural experience. That's not a pathology, right? But we can make it more comfortable, and we have all kinds of tools for doing that. So the one point I want to make about that, and we'll probably unpack this a little bit later, is that I never just plaster hormones on top of someone as, it's not like the first go-to. It's not just like, okay, here's this the answer to all your problems is just give you hormones. It's always in the context of what are the other steps we do to promote better hormone balance and ease of transition, and what other body systems do we need to, what do we need to not have blinders onto to make this all work so that your overall well-being is better. And then the hormones can just kind of get you that last little bit of comfort. And then there's other ways that we might use bioidentical hormones. So for example, I do use them in kind of a microdosed way as pieces of many of my adrenal rehabilitation programs, depending on, and those are always lab-based. So we may incorporate things like bioidentical DHEA or pregnenolone, which is a precursor to cortisol, among other things. I also use a lot of cyclic bioidentical progesterone, not just in menopause, although I pretty much use it like with almost anyone going through menopause, because it has just pretty much only a million advantages and really almost no disadvantages. But I do use that actually in women in their reproductive years too, for a lot of situations. One of them being pretty much everyone with PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. Bioidentical progesterone is kind of indispensable because it's not only a treatment, but it actually remedies the root cause of the physiology on some levels. Like it retrains our ability to, with people with PCOS, there's commonly a problem where the rhythm that we secrete a hormone called LH, or luteinizing hormone, gets, it's different. It's faster and not as coordinated. And so the glands that are trying to like hear the message and behave accordingly are like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what you're telling me to do. And so they can't do what they're trying to do, which the end result of is ovulate. And so there's a way we can use progesterone to bring that into a more meaningful and orderly communication between the brain and the ovaries, so that then you do ovulate and cycle regularly. And so there's a lot of different uses for these things, depending on in who and when.
Thank you so much for clarifying. And you mentioned that you're using bioidentical. I'm just curious, in this day and age, is there situations where people, if they are on hormone replacement therapy, not through you, may still find themselves not using bioidentical, or are doctors across the board more onto the bioidentical spectrum these days?
Mm-hmm. Both. So there's definitely more of a proclivity to use bioidenticals. So you'll see women on prometrium or estradiol patches, and those are all bioidentical. But I have seen people come in on synthetic estrogens, and I'm just at that point kind of face palming, like, why? Like, why? There's just so many better options, elegant and healthier options that have way fewer risks embedded in them. That said, I also see a lot of women, like if we want to talk about synthetic hormone replacement, I see a lot of reproductive age women coming in on progestins, which are basically the form of hormone that's used in most birth controls. And they're meant to resemble progesterone, but they more closely act like testosterone in the body, and they don't have any of the benefits of progesterone that are outside of the reproductive tract. So a lot of times women are given those to solve problems that could be addressed with bioidentical progesterone, and in my opinion, be addressed much better and with so many more benefits body-wide, globally.
Okay, thank you. So that's something for us to be mindful of, because there are still a lot of synthetic hormones being prescribed out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So interesting. So I know you talked about some of the pros and a couple of the cons just now with some of the synthetic side. But yeah, we're just curious, like, what are some of the pros that people would notice? When
There's a
starting?
lot of pros. There's a couple of risks or cons, and I think it's just best to be fully informed, right? That's the main thing, is making informed choices and knowing what's right for you and your body when. So we can't just say like hormones do this or hormones are safe for this. It's in who and when and in what situation, right? So basically, so one thing I want to say is that timing of introduction is very important. So for example, what we see is that, let's say we're using bioidentical hormones in a way to help a woman feel more vital during the time of her perimenopausal or menopausal transition. Well, what the research shows is that it's really important that you actually initiate use of the hormones, ideally before she hits menopause, meaning 12 months since your last period, but at least within the 2 years following. So after that 2-year mark, meaning you've stopped having a period, you haven't had a period in 2 years, your hormones are in that menopausal place on testing. That's not necessarily when you want to like then get someone on, especially estrogen is what we're talking about. I think there's a little bit more wiggle room with progesterone in certain cases. It's a little safer. The problem that we're concerned about there has to do with the way that shifts in estrogen levels mitigate or promote an inflammatory cascade of something called cytokines that are parts of our immune system. They're communication molecules in our immune system. And so one of the things we see at menopause is this onset of all of a sudden out of control inflammation, and that can manifest as expression of autoimmunity or flares of autoimmunity. It can show up as like arthritises or skin rashes or proclivity to developing insulin resistance when you like doing nothing differently than what you did in the past. There's a lot of different ways this can show. But What we're trying to do is stop that cycle, that avalanche of inflammation from getting set into motion, because once we do, it's hard to stop. And the answer is not just give estrogen. There's a bunch of other things you have to do to calm the inflammation. So if you can soften, blunt that sudden abrupt shift to low estrogen, then you can help prevent some of that inflammation from happening. And so that's why we want to start it then. You start to introduce estrogen, for example, like after that window, you run into potential increased risks of things like clotting and cardiovascular stuff, maybe in some women. So another thing is that if we're ever using something that promotes an estrogen, estriol or estradiol, I really encourage people to run lab testing to make sure they don't have markers, genetic markers or markers that would lead them to have more tendency to clot. So this would be like factor V Leiden, prothrombin time, there's a couple of others, but those are good ones to screen for, just to say like, hey, is this person pro-clotting? You know, because if they are, you might want to either take extreme precautions, monitor more closely, or maybe not introduce it. There's, and then you also look at things like, is this person, have known BRCA genes and is at higher risk for certain estrogen-driven cancers? Do they have a history of estrogen-driven cancer? That's probably going to lead, at least in my practice, for us not to use that hormone and to use different solutions. But also, it really depends on the woman, because you can have someone who's totally cancer-free and doesn't necessarily have those risks anymore, and maybe there's, it depends on a case-by-case basis what's right for someone. So so going back to your question, which was basically the pros, are that, gosh, you can get, massive symptom relief, right? So like for me, I'm just going to say, my experience is that I have liberally used bioidentical progesterone in my reproductive years, especially after my 30s, because really our progesterone starts declining by age 35. Everybody, all of us, not just some of us, all of us. And that is by design and healthy and natural. But we could start feeling it then and not really get that that's peri-menopause, guys. Like you're like 35 going menopause, what? But it is, we're talking about this beautiful 15-year or so window of transition that happens gradually in women's bodies. And there's so much empowerment to be found there of like learning what your body wants and how to do things just a little differently. So anyway, with me, progesterone was critical for resolving my insomnia, my sleep onset insomnia problems. It was one part of what I needed to do, but it was a huge piece. It's been instrumental in managing my PCOS and mood and skin. And so here's the thing is there's a lot of like symptoms that can be alleviated, a lot of them having to do with things like anxiety, sleep, regularity of timing of your periods, like getting those into a rhythmic cycle, reestablishing a period for someone who maybe has had one go missing. There's a lot of ways we can use progesterone that way. And so progesterone plays a role with GABA uptake and synthesis in the brain. And so that's the connection between the like anxiety sleep piece and why progesterone would encourage that. I also find that it's instrumental in women who are struggling with issues related to histamine reactivity or excess, because progesterone promotes synthesis of an enzyme called DAO, which mitigates or breaks down excess histamines. And so that can be really helpful, especially in that premenstrual period for some women who get histamine flares and things like that. So there's a lot of ways we can use progesterone for symptoms or for encouragement of just enhancing what's already there. And then there's a lot of things that like long-term benefits for things like brain maintenance of brain health and function, bone density, integrity of vaginal tissue, and muscle. There's receptors for progesterone on you name it, and our tissues have it. So there's a lot of ways where we're looking at kind of like longevity in progesterone and how it can work that way. I'll throw in one that's going to be a shocker too. I also use progesterone in people who have had a concussion. So this would be like men, women, children, it doesn't matter. Like you can use large doses of progesterone to protect the brain from damage related to a traumatic brain injury.
So interesting.
Yeah, so there's so many benefits,
Yeah, and it was part of my journey too, just kind of you sharing your journey a little bit. It was just when we worked together, 10 years ago at this point, almost. That was part of my, that was a big part of my journey. And what really, I think, catapulted, me and like I've gone a year without being able to get pregnant. And was about to explore, different options with my OB, and thank goodness, I decided to explore their options, and here I am, because I was, 34 when I started to have children.
Yeah.
So I was in that range, right? I was right around that premenopausal time. And so not to say that there weren't other factors that probably led, it probably wasn't just a decline of natural decline. And by design, there was probably a lot of stress factors involved and other things that it contributed to it for sure. But yeah, so thank you for breaking that all down and sharing, just how many different kind of all the connections. It was so fascinating to hear about.
It's profound too. And I mean, to your point, like you were one of those, I mean, working with you, that moment in your case stands out for me as one of those, like, it was just so fun. That's like one of those wins in medicine where you're like, yeah, like,
Love that. And you both bring up really great points. So Brie, I love like everything that you just broke down. It's going to sound so enticing for our listeners. I know people out there like, I need a lot of this in my life, and I need bioidentical hormones like to help me. But Angela, you brought up a great point, is like there was other factors in there. And so this is where I want to get into maybe some of the challenges or the cons of hormone replacement therapy. And also just like, this is why we work together as a collective, because of course we all want quick wins. We want the thing that's easier, right? Than maybe changing the stress in our life or our diet. But as a collective, like that's why we love focusing. Like we have you, Brie, we have your integrative team within our little realm here, so we can have that expertise and get this kind of support. But then we also have Angela, like your amazingness with mindset, changing your thought patterns, like doing this deep emotional release work. And then me on my end with the nutrition and really deep body nourishment, like bringing that all together is so important in this realm when it comes to like actual impactful. So as for those of you out there, I just want to remind you that like this has to be done with intention and done properly. And I would love if we could just chat about like maybe some of the things to just be careful about when moving into the hormone realm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the first one, what you just said, I was having this whole like aha of like, I was like, oh, we're problems 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. And then I will talk about exactly like problems related to taking those hormones. But what I wanted to say is that one of the biggest problems I see is people just taking the hormone and not addressing the underlying drivers. I did mention that. And so exactly what you're talking about is like why we work together and why what you guys offer and walk people through is invaluable. So one of the main ways that, so there's this piece about progesterone. Let's talk about progesterone. Hormones, both progesterone and estrogen, decline naturally as we approach, menopause, which hits at different times for women. And we'll have felt effects from that, right? Our hormones are like our Jing in Chinese medicine, and this concept of Jing, or the gas tank, like the total amount you get that you can't really, or historically you can't refill the tank, but you can, nourish how you use it. And so essentially by giving hormones, we are kind of refilling the tank. I mean, like literally, if you want to live to like 95 and still be like, sharp and active and doing your thing, you're going to want some hormones on board because they do decline, and that's part of how we just age. But the other pieces about not just giving and replacing, but nourishing, how our body burns through those more rapidly or not, is critical piece. You can't really do this well without that. So that's really what we're talking about is if our stress response or HPA axis, cortisol production, adrenal response is off balance, it's going to impact our reproductive hormone levels, period. And that's by design. That's not an accident. And so what I talk about, kind of the ways that our body reads stress. What does our body interpret as stress that then provokes a hormonal stress response? And there's 3 things. And so it's basically emotional stress, which is like, that proverbial running from the tiger, but basically that's, the solutions that you walk people through, Angela, all of the mind body, all of the like, how do we get into sympathetic mode in our nervous system? How do we get in our skin? How do we like feel like things are okay, and remind ourselves then that's a practice.
Absolutely.
And how do we find resources to help us deal with trauma, capital T and lowercase t trauma? So then there's the piece about the nutrition piece for me comes a lot about blood sugar balance. And so like If we are having surges and drops in blood glucose, that is a stressor. Our body thinks we just had an argument with our spouse. It just doesn't quite like have the same emotional impact, but it's the same hormonal impact or more, just from our blood sugar being out of balance. And so I know that's like one piece of what you would talk about with people is like, so how do we, no one teaches us that stuff. That should be like in high school. Like, yes, this is how you eat to keep your blood sugar stable. And yeah, there's some differences for people, but like we should all know this, and we don't. And it's so
I will add that we do teach this extensively in our Fatigue to Fabulous program. So
Yes.
for anybody out there who does want support and wants like specifics on how to eat and how to manage it,
Yep.
check out our Fatigue to Fabulous program in the show notes, because that's where we're teaching all this stuff on the regular.
Oh, so important, priceless. Like that just lasts a lifetime. It sets you up. People who come into my practice and understand those principles and are applying them are just so much better off than if their blood sugars all over the place. So I love that you're doing that with people. And so as you were talking, I was like, oh, that's problem number 2. Like you help solve that. So, and then problem number 3 comes in the form of hidden inflammation. And that's where lab testing and some of the work that I do and my team does come into play. We're looking for like, things like hidden pathogens in the gut or viral stuff, latent viruses, mycotoxins. There's a lot of things, but basically it's inflammation in the form of things that are challenging the immune system typically, and these could be foods. So these are often kind of hidden in the background. Like I think of them as like apps running in the background, taking up bandwidth. You're not always aware of them acutely, but they're there for a long time and they're messing with the function of the software. So basically our brain is reading the room. Its job is to read the room, evolutionarily and go like, you're safe, you're safe, you're safe, or not safe, adjust. Like, how are we now going to like shift how we're functioning to optimize our chance of survival? And it's like kind of that simple, our programming. So the problem is that when that happens, especially in women's bodies, there's this thing that happens where our body goes like, you're either in survival mode or you're in reproduction for the species mode. And like, yes, we are so much more than that, but physiologically speaking, we're kind of wired that way, right? So if your body is perceiving that there's all these stressors, basically your brain is sending messages to the glands that create and synthesize your female hormones to like calm down, because that's not what we're trying to do right now. Like if there's a famine and there's not enough food, probably not a good time to bring a kid into the world. It's not advantageous for your survival and definitely not for theirs. So let's wait until that's different. So what happens is your body's prioritizing the production of those adrenal stress response hormones that optimize different parts of your physiology, and it is down-regulating the optimal production of specifically progesterone, because embedded in the name progesterone is progestation. Progesterone's main role, as our body sees it, is to support reproduction. Now, we all know that progesterone does a lot more than that helps women, thrive. But in terms of, procreation and our survival as a species, progesterone's about getting pregnant and staying pregnant. And so it makes sense that those systems work that way. But that is why if we just throw progesterone at someone and we're not taking a look at like, hey, how is your adrenal function? Like, how are those hormones being produced? And what are the factors that are unresolved in your world that are contributing to them? And where do we have empowerment to change, to choose change, right? So what you guys do is critical. And then things like looking at like, hey, like, do you also have IBS, or do you even have maybe just some like hidden silent gut stuff, inflammation caused by dysbiosis of some sort that we should actually test and get a handle of. I know that so many of the women who come to me, I have like a gut specialty, but I also have people come in just for their hormone related symptoms that they don't really have pain points in their gut. Let's say, they're not concerned about gut health based on their function, but when we actually test, sometimes it's like, oh wow, like you're just handling it well, but you've got like 3 things that are pathogenic that are causing, and we can measure the inflammation, and I know I have to handle that, or that our body is going to read that as a stressor.
So cool. And we always kind of describe it as knowing your why, right? And so this is exactly what you're getting at. It's like, yeah, you might be in that season of life where hormones are naturally kind of tendering down, and you could use bioidentical hormones to support you and just feel that vitality in your body once again. But for a lot of these people in the adrenal community that we have here, it's like, okay, your cortisol's low or your progesterone's low. We want to know why, especially if you aren't even in that season of your life yet, right? And so the why. I mean, it could be environmental, it could be emotional, it could be a little bit from column A, column B, these 3 stressors that you mentioned too. And then all of those potential underlying condition, pathological conditions or sneaky stressors like in the gut, the mold, the mycotoxins, like you mentioned. Like, why is that cortisol low in the first place is really like, we want, as an example, cortisol, but we want to know like what's going on before just dumping hormones on it as a solution, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
So that's one of the challenges, I guess, is like wanting to do it and needing to know the backstory. Is there any others that we might have missed?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I would say that progesterone's pretty safe. I will say that I have seen people come in and they figured out independently, or maybe through some lab testing, that progesterone was low. And then they kind of said, well, I'm going to take matters into my own hands because I need some progesterone. They usually get progesterone cream. And one thing that I see happen is that it's like not wrong. They're not wrong. And they'll feel it. They'll feel better at first. For the first like month, 3 months, 6 months, they're like, oh my gosh, I think this is really my answer. I'm sleeping better, or I'm whatever, or my cycles, I don't have crazy symptoms, PMS and whatnot. But then what happens is that they will start to have their symptoms come back and go, well, maybe that wasn't what was going on. Maybe it was something else because I'm doing the same thing. So often what happens is that the delivery mechanism isn't as precise as we would love it to be. And what's happening with the creams, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but sometimes you'll get, because of creams being fat loving, they're in an oil base, right, to carry or to get through the skin. Then what happens is that sometimes the hormone will kind of like build up or sequester in the fat layer that's under our skin, but then dump into the blood in irregular intervals or quantities. And that's very confusing because remember, our hormones work on feedback loops. The brain is functioning with our reproductive glands that are still making some hormone. So it just gets confusing and things get a little dysregulated. And sometimes people wind up with way too much hormone in circulation and in the receptor sites, and then their body starts to downregulate. It gets resistant, just like if you get insulin resistant. So we can have the same thing happen with progesterone. I have had to sometimes have women come in and I have to kind of do a mini like detox of the hormones to get their body to then see the hormones again and then work with the replacement. So like there's these complications like that can happen. For the most part, people aren't taking too much progesterone. Like there's not a lot of, if you are, you can get, a lot of bloating and moodiness and kind of sleepy and groggy. And then that doesn't happen very often, but you can see that. And then with estrogens, biggest problems that I see there, and there's other hormones too. So I'm just focusing on those two a lot because they're the main ones that we see and use and talk about, but there's so many others. But like with estrogens, those have to really be monitored. So a couple problems I've seen is I've seen women come in on some level of estrogen, either in a cream or a patch or whatever. And so oftentimes they're not being retested. Like, hey, what level of hormone is there? Is this appropriate? Is this enough? Is it too much for this person's body? And like, so that should be retested usually at 6 or 8 weeks after stabilizing a dose. Another thing is that sometimes it's tested, but not tested against the levels of progesterone and testosterone. And remember, our hormones exist in a relative balance to each other. So it's like great to get someone's estrogen up, but not if they're perimenopausal to the point where their progesterone is in the tank, is just tanked. Then you're making them estrogen dominant. So like, for example, I would never, best practice that I've seen is to never give someone estrogens without progesterone and then to retest and make sure they're actually in ratio to keep you safe. Because there's roles of progesterone where they counterbalance some of the estrogen risks or effects. And so those exist together and should be looked at as such. And then the third thing I see is people not testing estrogen metabolites, meaning, okay, so now we've got the levels right, but what's your body doing with it downstream? Can you detoxify it appropriately? And are you there's different metabolites that we want to have, some dominant and some less. And like, is that happening? Because so many of us are coming to the table, frankly, with detox challenge. And if your methylation's off, or if you've had long-term gut infections, or you had a bunch of toxic exposure because you lived near farming or mining or just a freeway or whatever else you've had going on cumulatively, if your detox pathways aren't really working optimally and in balance, then like we can run into problems downstream, even if the actual overt hormone levels are okay in the blood. So those are things that need to be taken into consideration, I think, to be using these responsibly. And a lot of that legwork happens earlier. Like once you kind of get someone settled in that first 3 to 6 months and work out the kinks, then usually retesting can happen once a year just to make sure you're safe and for however long that person's choosing to be on those.
Okay.
This is what I
Really
love about
interesting.
functional and holistic medicine. There's just so many factors involved and so many pieces, and the fact that you're looking downstream as well. I mean, just so much good information. Oh my goodness. Just kind of processing it all too. So thank you so much for that. And I want to share kind of a really practical example of kind of what you were talking about a little bit there about a lot of people come to us with a topical steroid withdrawal, or they want to come off of their steroids. And how it affects people, or how they want to know what to do in that transition. So I guess certain people having that topical steroid withdrawal syndrome, I'm curious on how people get into that situation, first of all.
Okay. So, I mean, this is like a huge topic that could be like its own 2-hour discussion. But
Okay.
the short story is that so often people, like I'll see this a lot for eczema, let's say. So, current practice recommends corticosteroids topically, and they can be useful. Like in certain cases, they can definitely like get your rash to go away, get the eczema to calm down, and then and then that just works. But there is a tendency for some people to get into a cycle with it where they become dependent on it, but then also it creates kind of like this backfired skin condition where they can't get off of it, or else they have massive flares and pain and rashes, but also can have like more global symptoms with fatigue and not feeling well. So to be candid, I'm going to say this is not necessarily an area that I consider myself like the world's biggest expert. There are people who are, but I definitely have worked with some cases like this. And one of the things that we know is that with eczema flares, there tends to be cortisol dysregulation in the background anyway. It's not the only driver or related physiology change. We know that there's dysbiosis involved, like a gut-skin axis type thing, so we're going to look at the gut. But what happens with the cortisol is that there's going to be usually a spike at night, and that's associated with more itching and irritation and redness, like more flare of the rash, which often then interferes with someone's sleep, which then dysregulates the HPA axis more. So, and then the emotional stress around having that and the inflammation all dysregulate the adrenal hormones. So we're basically applying these topical corticosteroids in the context of someone who already has a dysregulated corticosteroid production and rhythm. And so one of the places that I've seen really help people get off of is to actually support those systems with hormones and with testing, like to actually run testing on the HPA axis, like a Dutch or something like that, and then to use protocols to help support those systems so that while you're taking those topical hormones away, and withdrawing them in a slow titrated manner, you're providing those hormones from the inside to help it not be so abrupt. And that kind of helps shortcut that like dependency cycle. So that's one of the things I do see helpful.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing, because like Angela mentioned, we do get asked about this a lot. And that's often what we tell them is, I mean, Angela and myself are not exactly experts in, the whole steroid withdrawal realm per se either, but we are experts in supporting those foundations of health that really help from the inside out, like you mentioned. And I feel like you just can't go wrong if you're struggling and you need support in that area. There are other ways that, of course, you can dig into things medically with testing, like you mentioned, to kind of just like see what's exactly going on, maybe hormonally, get those baselines, but you can't go wrong with the foundations, right?
Absolutely. I will say that like where I've used the same kind of phenomena happens in people with inflammatory bowel disease and other autoimmune conditions that are being managed with corticosteroids or other similar drugs. And I use the same type of approach. And those I just happen to have way more experience with. I have worked with a lot of eczema, but the person in my clinic who really is a specialist in that is Steph Davis. So, I mean, we have someone on our team. She just does more of the eczema stuff, and I do a little bit more of the other autoimmunes.
Awesome to know. This is a really great conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we know there are alternatives to hormone replacement therapy. You've mentioned some here for sure. But unfortunately, the alternatives aren't talked about as much, especially in mainstream medicine. So, can you
Mhm.
talk about alternatives, maybe delve a little bit more into that before we close, and that are available in your practice in functional and integrative medicine?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I think of these as they can be alternatives or adjuncts. And this really just is a personal choice, right? Like some women just know they're like, I don't want to take any hormones. I just don't. That's not for me. Fine. Okay, so we can do the best we can with other methods. So what I will say is that like ground zero, step one is balance your blood sugar and like learn what that means, right? So like I have handouts, you have in-depth courses, we have health coaches in the practice, but get some support around this and really understand how your body responds to foods you eat, at what time of day, at what activity level, and in what combination of macronutrients. Because, and it sounds overwhelming, but it's actually really simple once you get the hang of it. There's some basic principles. And when I have people like ditch the wine, ditch added sugars, and eat adequate protein throughout the day regularly, like boom, they're sleeping
Huge.
better, their skin looks better, their energy is better, their mood swings are stabilized, their anxiety is less, and their hot flashes went away like within 1 to 2 months, right? So that's even before we add in anything like adrenal testing and support or whatever. So that would be the other thing, is really work on rehabbing the HPA axis, your adrenal system. Like if you get those things stable, then a lot of this hormonal, like women who sail through menopause with no symptoms, they do exist, right? Like this is that woman who's not saying much while her friends, they're out, like, they're out at lunch or whatever it is, and her friends are talking about like their, power surges, or they're like, whatever else they're experiencing, the flashes, the sweats, the mood swings, and they're just going like, like, and they don't want to admit that they're like fine. And so like there was entire cultures of women where they just don't really like have a word for that transition because it's not a thing. Like we've made it into this awful monster that it has to be. And the truth is that if your HPA axis is pretty solid, you're going to sail through this transition a lot easier, because basically you have reserve where your adrenal glands do make some level of reproductive hormones every month, even while we're still in our reproductive years. But so they'll pick up where your ovaries kind of leave off, and the transition will be more gradual typically. So you're just not going to feel it, So like, for example, there's research. One of the research I love is on the, I love learning about the Hadza people in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. And so they, amazing. They have, whole sections of their microbiome organisms that we don't have. And they, there's so many, they don't die of degenerative disease. Diabetes is virtually non-existent, like things like this, right? But one of the things that happens is they literally don't have a word for menopause, because what happens is that typically there's a couple differences. One is they're hunter-gatherer and they still maintain that lifestyle. So they have more robust microbiome to begin with, which sets them up for better health in 27 million different ways. But also as hunter-gatherers, they eat their food on the go. Like they kind of eat the bulk of their calories while they're in motion, like while they're moving. And it's not like they wait till the end of the day and then they sit down and have this huge meal. So like that's already encouraging proper blood sugar balance, because when you're using your muscles to move, you're utilizing carbs, and if that's when you're eating your carbs, they're going to get used versus stored, right? So they have that going on. But they also have, like, often what's happening is they're having babies and they're pregnant, like maybe until they're in their like 40s, 44, whatever it is, and the nursing, they're young. And what happens is that the period of time after pregnancy during lactation, when your hormones actually resemble menopausal women, because your estrogen is so low. So what often winds up happening is that they're transitioning from breastfeeding into menopause, which means that it's not a big crash. So often it's just like, okay, I'm done. No more period. And that seems to be what women report. They don't report hot flashes and sweats and this huge upheaval of their lives, probably likely because of that. And so there's a number of ways that happens. So I think that there's a lot of ways we can mimic those things in our lifestyle. There's a lot of ways we can, some of that's choice, but we can mimic a lot of that stuff to kind of set ourselves up for success and to have that be easier. Working on gut health, critical. Working on our detox capacity and making sure those systems are just working well, and that can be working with a practitioner to do some testing, look at under the hood and go, anything I need to fix in here? Okay, cool. And then other things would just be tools like so, a lot of the herbal adaptogens have hormonal bents. So I love things like the Ayurvedic herb shatavari and maca, Peruvian herb maca root. We can use things like cohosh and Vitex to a point. Chase treeberry is another like hormonal ally for women. Now, Vitex only works when you're premenopausal because it works on the basis of the hormone LH that your brain is secreting, your pituitary hypothalamus are signaling your ovaries with. And once your ovaries stop responding to that hormone, boosting that hormone is not going to do anything. So, but it can be used to regulate cycles up until a point, so when women are having that, like, I'm frustrated because I'm having a cycle every 2 weeks or, more often than I should be. For some women, Vitex can be very powerful for a period of time, and using things like black cohosh and rhubarb that are phytoestrogens and flaxseed and things like that. So there's a lot of ways we can use those herbs to kind of buffer that transition. And then all the adaptogenic herbs for our adrenals can be really useful too.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So long story short, there's just so much that can be done. And what really gets us exciting, if for anybody out there listening who is struggling, who's never even dabbled in the functional world at all, like that gets us the most excited because there's just so many doors to open and explore here. And so I know I mentioned our Fatigue to Fabulous program, which is like a low cost way to work with our team and kind of get those foundations starting today. And then once you're inside the program, that's where you get the opportunity to really work with our team one-on-one and dig deeper into these tailored solutions. So for anybody out there who is struggling and wanting that support, come join us in Fatigue to Fabulous. And wow, this has just been an incredible conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this has been really fun.
But this was awesome. Thank you so much for all of your knowledge. And it was a great conversation. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing the work you do with everyone. So important.
Likewise.